Meng Haoran, Autumn, climbing Orchid Mountain, sent to Zhang. Here, among white clouds on North Mountain, you found contentment in seclusion. Starting the long climb to meet you, my heart soars with the wild geese to the heights. I might have given way to sadness as the sun went down, if it weren't for the joy of clear autumn air. Below me, I see villagers returning home, waiting on sands by the ferry crossing. At the far horizon, trees, small as water chestnuts. By the river bank, a crescent moon-shaped sandbar. Perhaps you'll come and meet me, bring some wine. We'll drink together to the double ninth. Okay, so here we have the first poem by Meng Haoran. We've already introduced this poet when we talked about Wang Wei. The first of Wang Wei's poems is dedicated to him. Meng Haoran was a Haitang poet, that is, he mainly lived and worked in the early and middle years of the 8th century. And he is the prototype of a failed candidate for scholar official. He tried to pass the examinations many times, he failed all of them. So whether he liked it or not, he ended up having to adopt the persona of the hermit, the worthy scholar that has not been able to serve in office. So his poems adopt the retirement poet, the retired official point of view a lot of the time. His specialty is in the poems on nature, and in this, as we commented, he is usually paired with Wang Wei, but with a difference, which is quite visible in this poem. Whereas Wang Wei tends to focus on nature by itself and beyond human presence, Wang Wei tends to paint a richer, more human, more inhabited rural landscape. So what's the topic of the poem? The poem is a landscape, the description of a mountain, or talking about a mountain. At the same time, it has a strong seasonal element. It's this landscape of this mountain, Orchid Mountain, in autumn. Now, autumn, I think we already mentioned it as well, is the favorite season for most classical Chinese poetry. It's a melancholy time, and most Chinese poetry has this melancholy tone. Autumn is associated with some beautiful elements in Chinese poetry, but also with the beginning of decline, of physical and intellectual decline. So it's a bittersweet moment of the year. So nature, landscape, mountains, autumn, and we could also say friendship, or not parting, because here the poets are already separated from the beginning, but the desire to communicate with another scholar official, another poet. So let's paraphrase the poem. The poem, it's a bit confusing. He starts talking about a climb to a mountain. From the title, we know that Meng Haoran is climbing Orchid Mountain, but he talks about another person, this Zhang, who is in North Mountain. And Meng Haoran starts the climb to meet him. But he doesn't climb North Mountain. He's climbing Orchid Mountain. We might imagine that the meeting that is referred to is not a physical one, or maybe a metaphorical one from peak to peak. Anyway, Meng Haoran is climbing this mountain, and he experiences some views that stir his emotions during the climb. Basically, he sees wild geese, which are an autumn symbol. Wild geese migrate in autumn out of China, I think. And seeing these wild geese, his heart soars, probably with a bit of sadness. And later he talks again of sadness. It's sunset, which is also a sad image. But there's also the clean autumn air that lifts his spirits. In the second stanza, the images move away from the poet, the sights of nature and his feelings, and towards other humans that are encompassed, that are perceived from the heights of Orchid Mountain. The poet sees villagers, and they're returning home, waiting for a ferry by a river. And Finally, we get these two images of how things change in perspective. So the trees from this height, the faraway trees look like chestnuts, water chestnuts, very small plants, and the riverbank looks like a moon. And finally, the poem concludes with an invitation. It started talking about how Zhang was living in the white clouds of North Mountain in content and seclusion, and it ends with a call to that same person, to that hermit Zhang, to come to Orchid Mountain and enjoy wine with Meng Haoran. The last line says, "We'll drink together to the double ninth." Now, the double ninth is a typical autumn celebration in traditional China. It was the ninth night of the ninth month, which in the lunar calendar of China was an equivalent to late autumn. And it was typical in the Double Nine festival to drink chrysanthemum infused wine with hopes of longevity. So what more can we say about the poem? The poem has some interesting images. So the first line or couplet, "Here among white clouds on North Mountain, you found contentment in seclusion." So the poem situates us in a mountain landscape, and a mountain landscape of hermits. White clouds are very frequently associated with hermits and with poets, scholar officials living a retired life in mountains. I think there was a very famous text written by an emperor to a scholar that was living in a mountain, and the text started with something like, "What is there to be found in mountains?" And the recipient, who did not want to go and serve the emperor, answered, "Why, what is there in mountains? White clouds are in the mountains." Now, white clouds can be a symbol of transcendence, of maybe the possibility of the Taoist sage climbing into a cloud and moving around, getting away from the phenomenal world. So they're also used by Buddhist poets a lot. And we already encountered this image of a white cloud related to Meng Haoran in Wang Wei's poem. So after this introduction, in which the poet says, the hermit is up there, we get some descriptions, some views of nature. As I said, most of these views of nature aren't just a pure description or contemplation of nature. They are immediately tied with feelings or with the sight of other humans. So wild geese, melancholy, my heart soaring, sun setting, sadness, clear autumn air, joy. In the second half, we have the villages, which are seen from on high. I've read in somewhere else that the images of the couplet that says, "At the far horizon, trees, small as water chestnuts, by the river bank, a crescent moon-shaped sandbar." These images were praised a lot by subsequent poets. They considered them very effective in the original poem and in the original language. Probably these are pure nature images, but they're comparing, associating things that are very different, or very paradoxical. So the trees look like chestnuts; they look tiny, and the sandbars in the riverbank look like the moon. So we're connecting different elements of nature with different shapes and different degrees of magnitude. And I think that will be all about this poem. So a poem describing a lovely mountain, rural, natural landscape setting, and describing very likely the emotions, the sad and melancholy emotions of the poetic persona, and the wishes that he has of meeting up with another scholar official.